like all the snacks, the gummy cherries, the apple heads. What about the mixtape?
Yes. Stop calling it a mixtape. The playlist is on your phone. We lost the station again.
Keep trying.
Hold on. Let me try this one.
Stop. That's it. Turn it up. Turn it up. Welcome to Murder Road Trip. I'm your host, Haley, and joining me on today's road trip is my dad, Dennis.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you for joining us. Very exciting stuff. So today we're going to talk about the Bloody Benders. John Bender Sr., or Pa, as everyone called him, was in his 60s when he moved to Kansas. Very little is known about where he was living prior to Kansas, but we do know that he was a German immigrant. He had a heavy German accent and spoke a little English. He was over 6 feet tall with dark eyes, bushy eyebrows, long hair, and a long beard. ZZ Top beard, I just imagine.
Sounds like a scary dude.
Would you be scared of him?
Depends.
Elvira Bender, or Ma as everyone called her, was in her late 50s when she moved to Kansas. Like Pa, Ma was a German immigrant and she spoke little English. Ma was a short, heavy-set woman with dark, gray-streaked hair. She was extremely unfriendly and unliked in the community.
So, do we know whether she was married to John Sr., or is there any clear evidence in any way with the relationship between them, what it actually was?
A lot of people think they were married or in a relationship together. A lot of people don't think that those are their real names, though. They think that they're pseudonyms or aliases.
Right.
John Bender Jr. was in his mid-20s when he came to Kansas. He spoke fluent English with a German accent. John Jr. was tall, slender, and handsome. He had auburn hair and a full mustache. John Jr. was liked within the community.
So, supposedly, he would have been John Sr. and Elvira's son, correct?
According to a lot of records, he was just John Sr.'s son, not Elvira's.
I see.
Yes. Kate Bender was in her early 20s when she arrived in Kansas. She spoke fluent English with very little German accent. She was petite, auburn-haired, and she was very attractive. She claimed to be a healer and a fortune teller, and she was the community's favorite Bender by far.
Let's see, looks like we have a newspaper ad here. It says, Professor Miss Katie Bender, and it says she can heal all sorts of diseases, can cure blindness, fits, deafness, and all such diseases related to that. And she could also supposedly make people who were deaf and dumb, which at the time meant you were mute and you couldn't hear, she could cure that. It gives her residence is 14 miles east of Independence on the road from Independence to Osage Mission, 1.5 miles southeast of Moorhead Station, and that's dated June 18th of 1872. So she had a little action going on there.
I will never complain again about having to read a map, because if those are my directions, I would literally never find a place.
Well, back in those days, there weren't a whole lot of roads, and, people ran more off of landmarks and what have you than relying on what we have today, street signs, and there was definitely no Google Maps or GPS happening then.
No thanks. Many experts believe that Kate was not Ma and Pa's child, but was actually John Jr.'s wife. And a lot of people believe that because she looked nothing like the Benders. So,
well, not to mention she spoke fluent English with no German accent.
Right.
So sounds like maybe she married John Jr. She was maybe lived here, had been born here.
Yeah.
Records show that in October of 1870, Pa and John Bender Jr. moved to Labette County, Kansas. It was about 15 miles north of Indian Territory, or what we know now as Oklahoma, and it was in the southeast corner of the state of Kansas. The Bender men claimed 160 acres of land off the only main road that crossed through Labette County. People traveled this main road often. Most of the travelers were men who were headed west for work or to find a place to live. A lot of times they were carrying quite a sum of gold because they needed to buy horses and food, etc. on their way.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
If you were traveling on this road, where would you have hid your gold?
Well, most of the guys that were riding, just plain riding horses, had saddlebags, and if you had a lot of it, gold's very heavy, so I'm assuming that they would have kept them in saddlebags. And if they were on a team with horses, a lot of times the wagon seats would have a box underneath of them where you could stash stuff, and they would most likely have put it directly under the wagon seat in there.
Where would you have put it? Because I know you like to hide stuff.
Well, I do, but you're kind of limited. I'm going to assume that I would have been riding a horse, and saddlebags is about the only place on a horse that you can keep anything that's heavy. I mean, you have to think about how much gold actually weighs. It's very heavy. Just a small brick the size of, say, a pack of cigarettes is going to weigh pounds. So, you'd have to have it in something fairly secure.
I see why we went away from that then. Those poor horses. I feel so bad they had to carry all that stuff.
Well, that's their lot in life. When Pa and John Jr. came to Kansas and claimed their land, when they started to build their new house, the first thing they did was they dug a pit where they wanted the house to sit, and then on top of that they put on a concrete and stone slab a few inches above the ground. And after the slab was complete, they built a 16 by 24 foot cabin, and this was about 100 yards off the main road. Inside the cabin, a trap door was constructed. The trap door opened to a cellar that had a back door that could only be accessed from the back of the house, and it was about 6 feet deep and 5 feet across. So we'll get into a little bit more of this later, but they basically built a killing house with a means to remove the body without anybody being the wiser, especially if they were in the house, because I'm sure it had no windows. Glass was a little bit hard to come by in those days. So this speaks to the fact that this was not their first rodeo. It speaks to the fact that they had devised a way through trial and error to be successful in their endeavors, which mainly included whacking guys on the head, cutting their throats, and stealing all their shit. So
one doesn't know that they want a trap door in these measurements with a stone slab, and you don't just know that when you become a serial killer.
No, somebody had some smarts. I mean, they thought it out well and created the situation in this cabin. The front of it was, they turned it into a store, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I thought it was interesting to know that they divided the store part from the residence part, and they divided it with a wagon sheet, which was basically a thick piece of cotton canvas, and that's going to play into the methodology that they use for, taking their victims out. But when they built the house, they also built a barn with a corral, and they dug a well. When the cabin and barn and well were all complete, Ma Bender, Elvira, and Kate moved in with them, and when they got there, they put in a couple of acres of garden. They had an apple orchard planted. The front room of the house was made into a grocery store. The Benders sold, liquor, groceries, tobacco, horse feed, things like that. The front room also housed the kitchen, and it had a table and chairs, which table and chairs were set so that they were very close to the wagon sheet, and when they wanted to kill somebody, it was very handy just to take down a corner of the wagon sheet and whack them on the head. But it was, being where it was, there wasn't a whole lot of dwellings and what have you around, so they had a stop off of the main road. It was right close where people could, buy food, water their horses, and spend the night if need be. So it was a well thought out setup.
Yeah. Prior to the Benders' arrival in Kansas, a man named John Sowers was found in the area with a crushed skull and a slashed throat. And later in 1871, a man with the last name Jones was found in the nearby creek with the same injuries.
So, very interesting that before they actually took up residence there, this mode of killing people, the crushed skull and the cut throat, was actually the way that they killed almost everybody that they killed, that we know of. So that speaks to the fact that they had perhaps scouted the area before they came through, and gives some credence to the thought that some historians have that they were actually drifters and moved from place to place and plied their trade while they were there. Kate did a really good job of luring people in, not only with her beauty, but she also told fortunes and supposedly cured these maladies. So there's a little bit of a grifter scheme right there, and then you have to factor in the good place to get supplies, which they were few and far between to get to back then. It wasn't like there was a quick shop on the corner and a Dillon's right up the street.
Right.
You had to plan for that kind of thing, and being where they were, it was a perfect setup for what they wanted to do. So
It's hard to believe that they would just happen upon this 160 acres that was right off literally the only main road, and that they would be able to set up a little grove. I mean, that's very hard to believe that they didn't plan that in advance.
well, I think they, I'm going with the idea that they moved from place to place and plied their wicked trade wherever they were. And I'm just, making something up here, but I think it's very possible that before they maybe camped in the wagon and caught people, and killed them and took their belongings, but they must have done it in a drifter type fashion. And I think that they were there in 1871 and 72, or right in there, and they actually killed those guys there, and they saw everything they needed. A creek, they could claim some ground there, and it was a pretty good setup for what they wanted to do. So I think, personally, after reading through all of the information that we were able to find, that they actually had been drifting around and doing this for a while.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Later on the next year, in 1872, two men were found on the prairie with the same injuries, the crushed skull and the slashed throat. The 1871 and the 1872 killings could be an example of the Bender family trying to kill people outside of the cabin.
I mean, it's awfully suspicious. We'll talk about this more in a little bit, but basically what they did was crush people's skulls with a hammer and then cut their throats. Back in those days, you were a lot more likely to be shot or, stabbed or maybe clubbed in the head, but have your skull crushed and have your throat cut, that's a pretty specific. So I have to believe that the Benders were involved in that as well.
That's not just random. Like, maybe if you just found somebody with their skull crushed, okay, but to have both the skull crush and the throat slit, you're like, especially when there was like two people living in this town, which wasn't really a town. So yeah, no one knows for sure how long the Bender family killed or what their exact method of killing was. Many sources believe that Kate would scope out potential victims with her charm. She would talk to travelers and find out how much money they had, what assets they had on them, things like that. She would use her charm to lure the travelers back to the cabin for a hot meal, healing, or a vision. Once the travelers arrived at the cabin, they were sat in their assigned seat. They did not get to pick their own seats, next to the wagon cover. Kate would serve the traveler as a sort of waitress in order to distract them. What's more distracting than a pretty woman, kind of floating about with your food?
Maybe show them a little cleavage.
Yeah, especially been on the road for a while. When the traveler was distracted, Pa or John would pull the curtain aside and hit the traveler on the head with a heavy iron hammer and then slit their throats. The traveler's body was then dragged to the trapdoor, where it would fall into the cellar. When night came, the Benders would strip the body of its possessions, then bury the body in a shallow grave next to the orchard. John would then take the possessions, horses, and/or wagons to a different town in order to sell them.
I'm going to bet that rather than cut their throat upstairs, I'm going to say that they probably clubbed them in the head, threw them through the trap door, and then cut their throats downstairs. Otherwise, you'd have an awful lot of blood to clean up, and blood doesn't clean up very easily.
So I think you're right, though I think they made that mistake a couple times, because a lot of people that went to the inn but then weren't murdered, because of course they didn't murder everybody who came to the inn, because that would be suspicious. Some people were put in really awkward positions, and they would later go on and talk about it, but they would say that the house smelled really bad, the wagon cover was stained.
I'm sure it was. You can't, if you hit somebody hard enough to crush their skull, you're definitely going to break the skin.
Right.
And head wounds bleed like none other.
Yeah.
They probably hit them more than once, so you're going to have spatter that's not only comes from the wound itself, but it gets slung off of the hammer when you swing it. So, yeah, I'd imagine it was pretty messy.
Yeah, I do agree with you, though, that they probably didn't just slit the throat right there, because a lot of the times the reason why they built this trap door was because anybody could walk into this grocery store at any time, and so they had to be very quick. Hit them with the hammer, drag them to the trap door, throw them down there, and then clean up the mess in case somebody came in. So I do agree with you. They wouldn't just slit a throat and let all that blood, because then you'd be gushing blood while they drag him to the trap door.
You'd be shooting blood. If you cut somebody's throat, the pressure, blood pressure will cause that wound to spurt blood. So it would have been on the table, it would have been on the cloth, it would have been on the Benders themselves. I mean, it's incredibly messy to slit a throat when the heart's still beating.
Are you speaking from experience?
Their statute of limitations has not run out, so we'll pass on that. We'll talk about that in about 7 or 8 more years.
All right.
May of 1873, George Longcore from Independence and his daughter Marianne went on a trip, and they ended up going missing. Their neighbor, Dr. William York, went looking for them, and his search subsequently led him straight to the Benders. When he got to the Benders, he was promptly murdered and thrown in the cellar. And it's interesting to note here that Dr. York would actually be their last victim, because after Dr. York went missing, his brother, Colonel York, a Civil War veteran and politician, would not let his brother's disappearance go unnoticed. So he put together a search team to find his missing brother, and lo and behold, the search team ended up at the Benders' cabin. So upon arriving at the Benders, Colonel York asked Katie if she had seen Dr. York, and she said yes, she'd seen him. He came by to the cabin, watered his horse, he made a small purchase, and rode on. In order to distract Colonel York, she offered to use her quote-unquote powers to help find Dr. York, but she couldn't do it that day because the setting wasn't right. I guess the moon and the stars hadn't lit up. She was probably really nervous and just wanted to get rid of this cat. So he said he'd come back the next day, but he didn't. A few days later, there was a story printed in a local paper describing how a wagon was found abandoned just outside the city limits. It was clear foul play was included there, and we have to assume that it was Dr. York's. After the article was published, the Bender family just ghosted. They were in the wind. They closed the cabin and took off. They left their livestock to starve. They just were gone, just like that.
Yep. Neighbors quickly put the pieces together. The Benders obviously had to be responsible for the abandoned wagon described in the article because they left so suddenly. Colonel York was soon notified of the Benders' move, and he arrived in town a few days later. Colonel York and the townspeople arrived at the Bender property and started searching the cabin. The cabin was left in shambles. There were dirty dishes everywhere and nothing was packed up. It was like what you would assume a place would look like if a bunch of people just left really quickly. They also found a trap door that had been nailed shut. The men pried the trapdoor open and a horrible stench filled the cabin. Everyone refused to go into the cellar, so a decision was made to put the cabin on rollers and move the cabin off the cellar. What? Explain that to me.
Basically what they did was they found several trees, let's say 8 or 10 trees, and they cut them down and they cut all the limbs off of them so that they would roll nicely, and then they jack up the cabin on one end and they'll put a couple of those trees underneath of there, and then they'll go to the other end of the cabin and they'll push on it, and then they lay those rollers down one after the other, and you can roll something really heavy on that just by every time you roll. You got 6 or 8 of them, you push the item along on top of the rollers, and when it rolls off of the last one, you take it and you put it in front of the front one, so you can move something pretty big pretty easily that way. Personally, if it was me, I think I'd have just gone in the door that was in the backyard, but hey, whatever floats your boat. So
I was exhausted just listening to you explain that. I would have never made it in these old times. The cabin was moved off the cellar, but no bodies were found in there, just blood, which explains the stench.
Yeah, if you have an accumulation of blood, especially as it starts getting older, it stinks terribly. It reeks.
Also, we'll talk about that in 7 or 8 years.
Sometimes it'll even ruin a blue barrel.
Oh, God. No. The men immediately started searching other parts of the Bender's land. They were like, there's blood. There has to be a reason for all this blood. Let's start searching the land. So they started searching for places that had loose soil or disturbed soil. And they found a spot near the apple orchard that had a bunch of loose soil. Dr. York's body was the first to be found. His body had been thrown face down into a shallow grave. And then after finding York's body, it was decided that the men needed more help. So they put off digging until the next day, where more men could arrive. The next day, 6 more graves were found in the orchard. There were no more loose soil graves, so the men took an iron wagon rod and prodded it into the ground in order to find soft soil.
So a wagon rod is it's a piece of steel or iron that's probably 6 or 8 feet long, and it would probably be an inch or so in diameter, and it would be easy to poke that into the ground to find out whether you found anything that felt funny or loose or whatever. If you dig and you disturb the ground, it doesn't ever go back to the same hardness, if you will, that the soil around it is for several years, and if it does, a lot of times there'll be a depression there.
Oh my gosh, I would have never thought about that, using an iron rod to do that. None of the bodies appeared to be over 9 months old.
So let's back up a second right there. They hadn't been dead for any more than 9 months.
According to sources, and who knows how much they knew back then about, how the body decomposes. But, where are the rest of the bodies if they've been... Oh, wait, are they in the creek and in the prairie? Probably.
If you drag them out in the middle, the coyotes will make pretty short work of them, so...
Right. All the victims had been robbed and partially undressed because they would take their shoes and anything like that to sell. And the heavy iron hammer was located inside the Bender cabin.
I think if I would have been the Benders and I was going to take a powder, I would have gotten myself 4 of those bodies, put them in the cabin, and set it on fire. At least that way you would have destroyed everything, and it's a possibility. Their forensic science wasn't particularly good back in those days. They probably would have just assumed that the Benders were, caught by smoke inhalation and had died, and that would have gone a long ways in allaying suspicion. But they took a powder and disappeared, so I guess in the end it doesn't really matter. There were several victims found during the search. There was a Howard County, Kansas resident named Ben Brown that went missing in 1872. There was a fellow named W.F. McCrotty, and his wagon and all his horses went missing in 72. There was a guy from Hamilton County, Indiana, named Henry McKenzie, and he and his horses went missing in December of 1872. There was another fellow from Howard County, a resident named Johnny Boyle. His horse and his saddle went missing in 1872. Sounds like they were busy in 72.
Oh, yeah.
There were a couple of Independence, Kansas residents, George Longcore, who was mentioned earlier, and his daughter Mary Ann, who was 8 years old. They went missing in December of 1872. It's interesting to note here that George was killed in the normal manner. He was struck in the head with the hammer and had his throat cut. Some say that Mary Ann was killed and thrown in the grave with George, and there are other sources that say that she was killed with a silk handkerchief that was still wrapped around her neck, and she was found, in a well or something?
Some say she was found in a well, and some say she was found in an orchard.
So, in any case, the Benders killed an 8-year-old child, but they did it with a different method than they did. My assumption with that is that the killing method that they decided on, which was to hit somebody in the head with that heavy hammer, they killed mostly men, and to hit somebody on the head like that incapacitates them immediately, so there wouldn't be any fighting at all. The throat cutting business was just to make sure everything was done. A messy way to do it, but hardly anybody comes back from that. The difference in the way they killed the daughter, Mary Ann, was probably due to the fact that she was 8. There's not a whole lot an 8-year-old can do with a grown man, and I think that they just killed her the handiest way they had. They didn't feel the need to incapacitate her first, so kind of an interesting departure from their normal modus operandi.
Everyone draws a line. They drew the line at not slitting an 8-year-old's throat.
Yeah, maybe, or maybe one of the women killed the girl. You just
that
never
is more
know.
of a less violent way to kill, which they say women tend to kill in less violent ways.
Yeah, a lot of times, they'll sneak up on a man in his sleep and set him on fire or whatever. Kind of sneaky, effective, but
Don't piss women off.
So there was that's my policy. So there was another guy named John Greery, another unidentified male, an unidentified female, and there were body parts from at least 3 other victims, but no complete bodies in those cases. In addition, there were 4 unidentified male bodies that were found in the creek, so they got lazy. They didn't even bury these people. They just took them down and chunked them in the creek. So sounds like, there was, even though they were cunning enough to pull this off, there was some, that's not real smart.
They might have been desperate, or...
Well, who knows? Or maybe, Pa told him to go out and bury him, and he said, the hell with it, I'm going to chunk him in the creek and go drink some liquor or something. So they also took an unbelievable haul in money for those days. But all of these guys they found in the creek had their skulls crushed and their throats slit. So...
yeah. In total, the Benders took at least $148,618 worth of cash or goods from their victims.
So that was $148,000 then, or the value of that money now?
The value of the money now.
So that's quite a chunk.
Yes. After word got out about the Bloody Benders, people traveled from all over to visit the Bender cabin. Travelers took pictures, and they often took pieces of the cabin as a souvenir. And it didn't take long for the cabin to just be torn to pieces.
So, an interesting side note, Laura Ingalls Wilder and family lived just a couple of miles from the Benders, and it's rumored that she also had spent the night there. They must have, had enough money at the time or something, or maybe we wouldn't know anything about the little house on the prairie.
Oh my gosh. My childhood would have been ruined. It would have been empty. There was a reward for the capture of the Benders, $3,000 then, or $60,000 in today's money. No one knows for sure what happened to the Benders. Some say John Jr. and Kate went to an outlaw colony between Texas and New Mexico. Others say John Jr. died at the border of internal bleeding. And there are reports that Ma and Pa went to St. Louis, but then others say they saw Pa in Montana, and then some even say they saw him in Michigan. Where do you think they went?
Well, it would be my guess that they fled and regrouped someplace else to do this all over again. I mean, they had plenty of money from what they took from these other people, and back in those days, it was fairly easy to disappear. It's not like today. You know, you could do something bad in western Kansas and move to eastern Kansas, take up a new name, and unless you were extremely unfortunate, nobody would ever know the difference. So, you know, nobody really knows where they went, but it sounds like they were a pretty effective team. So unless there was some friction somewhere, you know, I would assume that they went someplace else, regrouped, and went to doing it again, and maybe got a little smarter this time and learned from their mistakes and did a better job of getting rid of the bodies.
And that's why we didn't hear anything else.
That's what I think, because, you know, when we started talking about this, the fact that there were bodies found of people who were killed in exactly the way the Benders did it at that place, it sounds to me like they were moving around. You know, they maybe held their little store in the wagon, because it happened a lot in those days. You know, people would set up camp and maybe sell a few items here and there. And if they had like a nice big tent and then a fire, you know, a traveler who was going down the road who was ready to turn in for the night would almost always, you know, find some comfort in the fact that there were fellow human beings there, and he might ask to come join the fire and lay his bedroll out right there. And when he went to sleep, he got whacked in the head and got his throat cut for his trouble. You know, back in those days, there was a lot more trust because there were a lot fewer people. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you have to assume that they had been doing this all over the West and maybe back east too. But sounds like with the house, they got it down pretty good. And I would assume that if they went ahead and chose another location, that they would have honed that skill a little bit more, right, and learn from their mistakes in Kansas.
It would be interesting to know what they did prior to Kansas. Like, so it's almost like maybe their cabin in Kansas was the middle of the scale. So like, start at the beginning, how many fuck ups did they have at the beginning? Where did their MO start? Then we get to the cabin, they were still a little sloppy, and then where did they end up? So, I mean, that's what I hate about the 1800s, because there's really nothing written in stone, because one, all of those people are dead, and there weren't phones and the internet, and a lot of this stuff people thought was just folklore. Mm-hmm. Like, people would go tell stories of, I stayed at this inn and I was almost murdered, and people were like, oh, you're silly. And so I would just be so interested to know their before and after.
Well, I found several things very interesting about the Benders. One of them is, it's interesting that those four people were of like mind. And now let's operate under the assumption that John Sr. and Elvira were a couple, and that John Jr. was their child, or conversely, it could have been that John Jr. was already with John Sr. and then they picked up Elvira later. But I mean, can you imagine, especially back in those days, there weren't a lot of people. Mm-hmm. You get four people together who are all okay with, you know, whacking people in the head, killing them, and taking all their stuff.
I want to know how that conversation works. Like, well, you have to slowly, I guess, introduce it to the, like, don't you just ever wish you could just hit a guy on the head with a hammer? And then later on, don't you just wish you could just, like, slit somebody's throat sometimes?
Yeah, it would have been interesting to see how that came about, but let's take a little closer look at Kate again. That the business with the occult and telling fortunes and being able to miraculously cure, you know, blindness and the ability to walk and what have you, that was a big deal back in those days. I mean, people were still fairly superstitious, and anybody who has the ability to be a good grifter is going to have it pretty smooth and down pat.
Oh, yeah.
So you have to assume that, Kate was shady to begin with.
A lot of people think she was the mastermind behind everything.
It wouldn't surprise me a whole lot. It doesn't sound like the elder Benders were terribly intelligent, hardworking perhaps, but not too intelligent. But it could very well be that Kate was the mastermind. I mean, she obviously had a fine mind. You have to be pretty damn smart to be a good grifter. And
I couldn't do it.
The fortune telling is definitely a grift. I mean, back in those days, they also practiced what they called phrenology, and that was measuring a person's skull in various ways, and it would predict what that person was going to be, whether they were a madman or a good Samaritan. They mostly used it to try to classify criminals so that they could essentially lock them up or kill them before they actually committed any crimes.
Right.
If you had a Neanderthal-like brow and a bumpy head, you were automatically assumed to be some sort of terrible person. So a lot of superstition and a lot of gray instead of black and white back in those days.
But in 150 years, they're probably going to look at we do and think the same thing.
Well, hindsight's always pretty damn good. Some of the stuff that they came up back in those days is still valid today. The elliptical movement of the planets around the sun was something that I believe Copernicus came up with, and that was a year ago. So some of it holds out true, but unfortunately, there was a lot of ignorance in those days, and ignorance breeds superstition and fear.
It's true. Yeah. Well, that's the Bloody Benders, guys. Thank you for listening. Thanks for coming on the show, Dad.
Oh, happy to do it.
You can find Murder Road Trip at murderroadtrip.com.
On Facebook at MRT Podcast, and on Instagram and Twitter at Murder Trip. If you enjoyed this episode, which I'm rather sure you did, if you have a problem with it, I'll come see you personally. Please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your podcast app of choice. I am happy to announce for Haywee that we have a contest for everyone who leaves a review. If you leave a review in the month of August or September, you will be entered to win the Murder Road Trip Survival Pack. You can find more details on our website or any social media site. Please stay tuned after the music to hear from some other great podcasts. Thank you for coming along for the ride, and thank you, Haley, for having me.
Remember to check your back seats, and I'll see you at the next rest stop.
This is Esther, host of Once Upon a Crime, a podcast that shares true crime stories chapter by chapter. Crimes are covered within series like, we're in the series Monstrous Moms and Dastardly Dads. This is Chapter 2, John List. Killer Kids, Chapter 1, Jesse Pomeroy. Murder in Paradise, Chapter 3, Missing in Aruba. This is Chapter 1, A Woman Scorned, Betty Broderick. As a storyteller, I share not only the details of the crime, but also my research into the backgrounds of the victims and perpetrators to try to understand why events unfolded as they did and to offer clues into how and why these crimes occurred. You can find more about the show on truecrimepodcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey guys, it's Lainey, host of the True Crime Fan Club podcast. If you're a true crime addict like I am, then my podcast is for you. It's a podcast for the ultimate true crime enthusiast, giving you a glimpse into the life and crimes of the most demented minds. You won't want to miss an episode.